Right, good morning everyone, and thanks all of you for coming to the seminar. And we're delighted to have James Andrews with us today to talk about merger simulations in EU merger control. Jamie is at Campus Lexecon, where he has worked on some very high-profile mergers, I think including the Sainsbury's, yeah. So lots of interesting merger stuff, also litigation and other types of cases. We have actually worked together on NS3 Apple, which has class representative Sean. So and it's a case that is still going. But anyway, it's really it is great to have Jamie with us today, and to you.
Thank you, Peter. Nice to see everybody today. So I work at Campus Lexecon. I've worked as a competition economist for 11, 12 years now. I started my career at a different consultancy, and I've been at Campus Lexecon for about 7 years now. For those who don't know, we're a competition and economics consultancy, so we advise on all matters to do with antitrust and competition, including merger reviews, abuses of dominance cases, cartel investigations, etc., etc. So today we're going to talk a bit about, as Peter said, this technique called a merger simulation. So for those who don't know what a merger simulation is, it's a technique. It's an economic technique that's used in sometimes in merger reviews, and it seeks to understand what exactly would happen to prices in the market after a merger, and therefore whether the merger is likely to be considered anti-competitive or not. They've not been used that much, so just for a bit of context, they've been used in only 14 mergers reviewed by the European Commission since 2000, and I think in that time the European Commission will have reviewed literally thousands of mergers. So it's a fairly rare technique. Not just that, it seems to have fallen off as well. So the last merger that featured a merger simulation in the EU was 2018. So it's been over 6 years since there's been one of these used. So one of the questions that myself and Peter are trying to answer is why they are not being used anymore, and therefore what might we do to get them used again. So like I say, merger simulation was a technique developed in the US in the 90s. And when I started my career, it was very much seen as the gold standard of economic modeling you could do in a merger review. Because there are other techniques that you may have heard of, such as the UPP, which stands for upward pricing pressure. It's a model that's supposed to tell you, give an approximation of how prices might rise following the merger. But what a merger simulation is instead it's more precise. It's designed to be a more precise quantification of what happening. So it's not just going to tell you how much emerging firms might have incentive to raise their prices post-merger, but also how existing competitors in the market might also react and change their prices as well. And one of the things that a merger simulation is particularly useful for is when you need to model divestment. So for those that don't know, sometimes in these merger reviews, if the competition authority, so in this case the European Commission, decides that a merger is likely to harm consumers, they will sometimes ask for the merging firms to make divestments. So that might mean them selling off a particular brand or selling off a particular business unit. A merger simulation is particularly useful for modeling this, because if the model is granular and detailed enough, you could say, okay, what would happen if we merge firms but then sell off this asset or here or this asset here? What will the model spit out in terms of predicted price rises? So, like I said, it was considered the gold standard. However, it does typically require more data than other similar models. So that could be the time and resources is often a constraint that barriers in these merger reviews. That might be a reason why they're not being used much recently. So like I said, so you can see here, hopefully on the timeline, is the timeline of all the different mergers that are featured in merger simulation. So the first one back in 2000 was a merger between Volvo and Scania, which was actually blocked by the commission because both brands were particularly strong in Scandinavian countries, and the merger simulation showed that yes, price rises would be particularly high in Scandinavia. And then you see there was a bit of use in the 2000s, a few mergers here and there, but then it really kind of picked up in 2010 through to 2016. And you can see here that a lot of these mergers were in the telecoms industry. So telecoms markets are very national across Europe. So there was a merger between there was Telefonica Deutschland, E-Plus in Germany, 302 in the UK, which you might recall was actually blocked. There was in Spain, Orange Jazztel, 3 and Wind merged in Italy. So there was a period where every year there was a national telecoms merger, and the European Commission was getting very good at making these merger simulation models to decide whether the merger would be anti-competitive or not. But then, like I said, the last one was a Dutch telecoms merger between T-Mobile and Tele2 in 2018. Since then, there's been nothing. And the question is why? Because there still have been some telecoms mergers since 2018. They just haven't featured merger simulation. By the way, if you have any questions as we go through, please feel free to ask. So what we've done first is we've just looked at these cases and see if there are certain patterns that we see. So apologies if you can't see it that clearly, but basically what these bar charts show is each of these charts adds up to 24. So there were 17 merger simulation cases, and then in those there were 24 models put forward. So in some cases, both the European Commission would put forward their merger simulation model, and also the merging parties would put forward their own alternative merger simulation. So we add up to 24. So in the first chart, we see this is a split of these mergers by industry. And the blue bar, you can see that there was a big, as I said, a big focus on telecoms in the kind of 2010s. Otherwise, there's a real kind of split that's been used in lots of different industries here and there, usually only for one case each. So for example, yeah, Volvo Scania, like I mentioned, was automobiles. There was one between enterprise software companies, Oracle and PeopleSoft, etc., etc. So yeah, there was lots of use in telecoms, but not much use in other industries. Moving on to model choice. So one thing I probably should have said is that a merger simulation model, that is the most basic form, combines an economic model of demand on one side, an economic model of supply on one side. You put them together, define a pre-merger equilibrium, and then what you do, you basically say, let's see what happens when the firms merge by combining their assets, and then the model will then give you a prediction of how each company's incentives to change price will be. So obviously, because there are lots of different demand models out there, as I'm sure you know, and because there's lots of different ways that companies compete and supply on the other hand, you can in principle have lots of different combinations of demand and supply models that form a merger simulation model. So this chart here shows all the different types of merger simulation model that have been used. So, for example, this first one here means that on the supply side, the company is competing on price for trend, and then on the demand side, the firm creating the model has used a so-called calibrated demand model. Likewise, Orange is the same on the supply side, but on the demand side, the demand model instead is an econometric nested logic model, which you may have heard of. So as you can see, there's basically two main types that have been used. Earlier on, a lot of them were these, the demand model was nested logic econometric nested logic, and then a lot of these later on were the so-called calibrated demand model, and a lot of these correspond to the telecoms cases. So what happened was that the Commission developed a model in the first case, where they calibrated the demand side, and then as the mergers going forward in time, they kind of kept on reusing that model, so there's a kind of strong precedent over time. There's an argument that these models became a bit more sophisticated over time. So for example, there's this demand model that seems supposed to be quite sophisticated called BLP. It's supposed to be a more sophisticated version of nested logit. That was attempted in one model. You can't really see it, but it's here. Likewise, there were some models put forward by consultancies later on, which also did some even more sophisticated modeling. And then in terms of the economist firm, like I said, the Commission, the blue bars, the European Commission has put forward the most. But then in these cases, like I said, it could be that either the Commission puts forward a model in a review, but also emerging parties, consultancies, like for example, my consultancy, Lexecon, could also put forward their model, which would then get reviewed by the European Commission. And in some cases, both sides put forward a model. They usually don't match their predictions, and then you get into a bit of an argument about it. It's the kind of nature of debates in these merger reviews. But yeah, like I said, the majority have been done by the Commission. Following that, Lexecon, my firm, has put forward the most. Otherwise, there are some other agencies and consultancies have done one each. And then, like the next one, it just looks at all the 17 mergers and how the review went ahead. So for those that aren't familiar, mergers will either go to phase 1 or to phase 2. Phase 2 is kind of the more complex mergers, the mergers that are most likely to be anti-competitive. So as you can see, the majority of these cases were indeed phase 2 cases, and in 2 cases, for the red one here, they were then ultimately prohibited for being deemed to be too anti-competitive. So certainly the cases that have featured merger simulations have tended to be the biggest or most complicated cases. So the first question is, have they not been used much recently because they were very successful in the past? So we looked at this from 2 angles. The first is a literature review. So there's been lots of work on whether mergers have been as anti-competitive or pro-competitive as they thought they would be before the merger. So it's a typical before-after study. We look at prices before the merger, prices after. Did prices go up? Did they go down? There's been a lot of work on that. There's been a much smaller area of work on the actual. So these cases actually, these are papers where they've actually done a merger simulation before the merger took place, and then they actually were able to collect post-merger data and then see, okay, was the model actually good at predicting what happened in reality? So it's not a huge literature, and but one might optimistically say that on the whole, predictions can be quite accurate for these different merger simulation models. In some cases, that wasn't true, but from this small sample of literature, you might say, okay, things are generally quite good. The second way we analysed this was a more qualitative assessment. So for a bit of background, these the European Commission, when it assesses these mergers, they have to then write this very long decision at the end of the merger, explaining all the reasons why they decided to let the merger through or not. And these decisions can go very long. They can go to hundreds of pages, thousands and thousands of paragraphs. And what's good about them is that when economic evidence is presented in these cases, they will write a detailed description of what the economic evidence was, how it was interpreted by the Commission, arguments put forward by the merging parties, how they respond to these arguments, etc. So what we've done is that these decisions have actually formed the basis for the analysis in this paper. So what we've done here is in each of the decisions, we've gone through and looked at all the different modelling issues. In terms of a merger simulation model, we looked at all the different modelling issues. So sorry if you can't really see this. For example, if this one says survey methodology, market definition, model choice, how the outside growth is modeled. And then basically, we then classify them as red, orange, or green, depending on whether that particular modelling issue was kind of agreed upon between the two sides, because it's a very adversarial debate in these cases. You know, it's very much like we as consultants have our view of what's going to happen, because the Economic Commission, European Commission has their own, and there's a lot of, it can be quite adversarial. But in any case, we've tried to group these into successful, neutral, or unsuccessful. So then, and then you just kind of, in the chart, you then see that, you know, certain modeling issues came up a lot. Certain modeling issues didn't come up at all. And some of them were very controversial. Some were more kind of agreed upon between the two sides. But yeah, I mean, you could draw many inferences from this, but I would say that basically it has been quite mixed. There has been a lot of criticism, but there has also been examples where the Commission has said, yes, we agreed with how the merging parties modelled this particular thing in the legislation. Then what we did is basically, instead of listing them by issue, we then took each of the 24 models. So again, apologies you can see, but each one of these is one of the 24 merger simulation models put forward. So this first one is the merger between Unilever and Sara Lee, who produced deodorants. The model was a nested merger model, and it was put forward by the European Commission. And then in that decision, 10 modelling issues were discussed. And you know, there's a roughly even split between good, neutral, and bad. But what you can see is that by doing it by model, you can maybe then see that certain models, on the whole, dealt with things pretty well, whereas some models were pretty much completely criticised by the other side. So one could maybe say that if you were to put forward a merger simulation in a merger today, there are certain cases that you should maybe follow to make sure that you don't fall into the pitfalls that some of these cases down here. So I mean, overall, have merger simulations been successful in the past? I would say possibly, but you know, it's certainly not clear.
Jamie, just one thing, it just occurred to me, if you go back to the previous chart. One thing that would be useful is to put next to these bars is the average price fact estimated, because what just occurred to me is, of course, if something is really contested, like those red ones at the bottom, those are probably, are they more, sorry, it is a question actually rather than a statement. Are they more likely to be merger simulations that were proposed by the EC, probably predicting very high price increase, so of course the other party started to contest it, whereas if the predicted price increase by the EC is not so high, maybe it's less contested.
And also vice versa as well, right? So, sorry to interrupt, but this one here, for example, was a merger simulation put forward by a consultancy where their model was predicting 0% change in price, but it was pretty much trashed by the Commission, and hence everything is red.
I agree, yeah. So, but in principle, if the Commission predicts a low price increase, it's really unlikely that anyone would contest it.
Yeah.
Whereas if the party is put on a low or a high, then maybe it's more likely. But anyway, it's just, I think it would be useful.
Yes. So the second question is, have they not been used recently because they've not been implemented in a consistent manner? So like I said, a simulation model is a mix of a supply model and a demand model. But of course, you can, on the demand side particularly, you can estimate consumer demand in multiple ways. In principle, how you do it shouldn't really have an impact on how the merger simulation then predicts prices. But of course, you know, let's see whether that's true in reality. So, and again, to kind of motivate this section, there are, you know, as like I said, the debate in merger control is quite adversarial. There's this general, very you know, potentially quite populist view that merging firms will only hire economic consultants who will say what they want you to say and predict very low price rises. So this last quote here is from a particularly outspoken academic who you may have heard of, who was also the chief economist of the European Commission a few years ago. He's very critical. He says that obviously merging firms will hire consultancies who will put forward merger simulations that predict zero price change, and therefore you shouldn't really attach any evidentiary weight to it. Another way that people have complained is that, like I said, a lot of these mergers were in telecoms. And one of the complaints of the merging firms in that 302 merger that was brought by the Commission in 2016 was that basically they were always putting forward merger simulations in telecoms cases, and therefore you're more likely for the Commission to find a high price rise or an anti-competitive effect if you work in telecoms compared to other industries. And similarly, there's this idea that, like I said, that the prediction from model could vary quite a lot depending on what type of model, what type of demand model you actually put forward. So here's an example from an economist, Walker, where he says that, look, if you look at the different predicted price rises of these firms in this market, I think this is based on some simulated data that it can change quite a lot depending on the functional form of demand. So for the analysis, we've used the same data as before, which are these long decisions that the Commission writes in each case. So here are some examples of the data we kind of went through in the paper. So in some cases, like this one on the bottom left, they put forward these nice tables showing all the predicted price rises of the various players in the market. And then in some cases, they just have, they just write a paragraph to say the merger simulation model predicted price rises of 1% in the UK. So we took all that, put together a data set. So one thing that we needed to consider was that they don't present these results in a consistent way across the cases. So these are all the different. So this row would say that basically there are 8 merger simulation models where the merger simulation results they present covers both emerging firms, the competitors, and the market overall. Whereas for some it's just the market, just the merged entities, etc., etc. So we have to be mindful of that in the analysis. And then this gives an overview of the kind of sample size that we're dealing with. So there's only been 24 merger simulation models used, so that's sample is quite small. In terms of the actual unit of observation for the regressions that I'll show later, it's the predicted price rise of a player in the market. So that could be the merged entity, it could be a competitor, it could be a market. In a given product or geographic market. So the example I used of the Volvo-Scania merger was a merger between truck companies that operate all over Europe. So, each country and each type of truck would be its own observation in this data set. Similarly, these analyses often contain a kind of baseline estimate from merger simulation. Sometimes they also show sensitivity estimates as well, so we can include that. So these are sample sizes. So when we just consider the merged entity, because obviously the focus usually in these models is how are the merging firms going to change prices post-merger. The kind of secondary question is how are competitors also going to change prices post-merger, and then also for the market as a whole, will prices increase? So, and then when we just consider the main models put forward, we have 113 observations, which is quite small, but once you include all these sensitivities, and once you include all the other market participants, you get to a fairly large, definitely not huge, but a decent sample size. So just some high-level summary statistics. So we'll focus on the first column, price rise column. So basically what this shows is that across all the telecoms, all the models before the telecoms, the average price rise was 12%. All the non-telecoms models, the price rise was 8%. And that difference is significant. So perhaps there is evidence that in some ways, telecoms companies were treated potentially unfairly in this. Similarly, when you look at the models that were based on econometric demand, so nested budget, ELP, value coefficients, etc., versus non-econometric, that's mostly calibrated models. The difference again is much lower for econometric, 7%, 11% for calibrated models, again, a significant difference. And then when you look at consultancies versus non-consultancies, which again is mostly the European Commission, the difference is also quite striking. So consultancies put forward models that on average predict price rise of 5%, whereas the Commission is more around 11%. So yeah, there is some, looking at differences in the means, there's potentially some evidence that those hypotheses that we discussed on the previous slide. But of course, we would want to control for other factors that might be affecting price rise. So an important one is the combined share of emerging firms. So of course, if the larger the combined share, I mean the larger the concentration, the larger the effect of the merger in the market, all else equal, more likely that the model will predict higher price rises. And then similarly, we've included some extra dummies for whether the model factored in synergies. So it's a whole topic on its own, the topic of synergies and efficiency. But basically, if the merging firms often put forward to the Commission that their merger will bring about all these wonderful improvements in efficiencies, which will allow them to lower costs, and therefore, all else equal, mean that price rise should be 0 or maybe even negative. The Commission is extremely sceptical of this and has a very high threshold for accepting synergies arguments and merger control. That said, some of them have been accepted, so this dummy captures feasible models where the synergies, marginal cost savings in the merger were factored into the model, which brings down the price rise. And similarly, we include dummies for whether the merger went to phase 2, like I said, more complicated mergers, or mergers with one. So on this slide, what we do is we're just comparing some average price rises. I'll just explain what we're showing. So basically, the three kind of factors of interest is the industry, telecoms versus non-telecoms, model type, econometric versus non-econometric, and comms consultancy or non-consultancy, which is equivalent to the European Commission, essentially. So basically, what this says is that price rises on average are 80% for telecoms cases, whereas non-model econometric for qualified consultancy, and that's the highest. Of course, these sample size there is quite small. And the combination which was most popular is this one here, which is in the telecoms industry, non-econometric demand, so calculated demand put forward by the European Commission, and on average they're finding price rises of 11 to 12%, which is considered quite high. So just the context, in one of the cases, I think it was Unilever, Sara Lee. They did this merger simulation model predicting price changes in all these different markets across Europe. And basically, the countries in which they had to divest brands, so sell brands to other competitors in order to get the merger approved, corresponded to the markets where the merger simulation model predicted price rises of 2% or more. So I mean, for context, the predicted price rise of 11% is considered rapid.
I think it's really interesting. But I mean, in particular, this table, one of the things that it points at very clearly is a gigantic moral hazard problem on the part of the of the entity that conducts the analysis. Because I mean, the differences between consultancy and non-consultancy are very large,
Yes.
And consequently, if you just see them, the basically who does it is at least as important as what model you take and what information you have, which in the end But of course, the entire methodology to a question to which extent it is really scientific, or whether the margins that you can decide on within the scientific boundaries are so large that you can tweak the outcome to what you wish.
Yeah, I think that's certainly one interpretation. I would say that I think it can be a bit more nuanced than I'll turn about in the next few slides, and certainly sample sizes there certain cuts of data are not huge, so you should be careful to draw too much inference from that. Or similarly, there are other factors that are impacting these price changes, but we're not seeing control for. But yeah, certainly on its face, there's been, there's a lot of variance in the price rise depending on the values of these three different factors. So maybe there is a basis for these hypotheses. So yeah, so like we say, we move on to regression analysis next. So apologies for the color coding. Basically, I know it's not how you typically see it in academic articles, but I am a consultant. So we do like colors. Green means that it corresponds to one of the hypotheses on the previous slide. Orange means it doesn't. So there's a lot of green. Just to kind of explain the table. So we've got the different columns correspond to the different samples that I showed on the previous slide. So different sample sizes increase from 113 up to 900. And what we see is that yes, the coefficient on the telecoms dummy is always positive and significant, with an exception here, which I'll mention. So yeah, this means that the telecom spaces price rises are 9 percentage points higher than non-telecoms cases. Yeah, 9% is large economically in this context, as well as. In terms of, so it goes negative here. This is where we include all these different sensitivity models. And there's one particular case, this Oracle top case where.
So we've got a comment online. Helen, please.
Hi, I put a message in the chat, but you won't have seen it. So I was just wondering whether it would be interesting to split your sample of consultancy results between those working for the merging parties and those working against the merger. I mean, having worked on a number of transactions, particularly in telecoms, one thing in the telecoms sector is you tend to get quite a number of different parties, i.e. you've got people opposing the merger who hire their consultants, to show how terrible it would be, as well as obviously the merging parties themselves who typically will hire consultants, which might not be reflected in some other sectors where, potential detriments occur, in a very dispersed way to consumers rather than to particular opponents.
Yes.
Parties vertically as well. I mean, in telecoms, you've got quite a lot of commercial operators who are related to the merging entity in various different ways. So, consultancies get hired to oppose mergers as well as to, advocate for them.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah,
data could allow this split, but it'd be an interesting one to do.
No, certainly. I'm sorry. Maybe I should have clarified. So thank you for the comment. So in this context, when we say consultancy, we mean consultancy working for the merging parties. So if I just go back to...
Okay, that's interesting then, that the telecoms ones have that direction.
Yes, well, yes. So let me then explain this 18%, which is quite high. So
yeah, what
happened was there were two cases, one in Italy, Wind 3 joint venture in 2016, and T-Mobile Tele2 in the Netherlands in 2018. Both of these models were put forward by my company, Lexecon, so I have a bit of knowledge. I didn't work on these matters myself. So that's what the N=2 is for. And basically these models, what they were trying to show was that they basically were trying to factor in kind of efficiencies and technological changes what that would occur because of the merger. And this is obviously quite topical at the moment, given
Yeah.
Vodafone 3 merger that was just cleared in the UK.
Mm.
But anyway, going back to phase 2 models, what we tried to do was to show that the improvements in the product offering, I think, to do with network speed, network coverage, factored that explicitly into the model. And they basically showed that even though there would be an incentive to raise price, which is very high, so 18% on average, what their model was arguing was that actually the change in consumer surplus would actually be so that's what that high 18% on the first row is shown.
Yeah, okay, so it's not quality adjusted prices, which is another very tricky thing here.
Correct, and then that is one thing that I want to, this would be the only 2 cases where I believe there wasn't quality adjusted prices, but one sensitivity I want to do is to drop these in the sample and see what happens, because yes, these 2 models are a bit different to the other.
We also have Tanya Salem. If you'd like to speak up, please. We're not hearing anything. Do you want to carry on and try again?
So yes, telecoms dummy is positive and significant. The econometric demand dummy is negative and significant in some specifications, which is supporting this idea that maybe price rises are lower in econometric models. One theory that Peter has is that, like to your question about what you can flex in these reviews, in a calibrated model, you basically say, okay, the diversion ratios, we'll find some evidence to say that the diversion ratios between the parties and the competitors is X. We'll just plug it straight in, and we'll find some data on margins of the merging parties and plug it straight in. Whereas econometrically, you would use kind of scanner data to try to estimate the kind of parameters of demand directly. There's an argument that Peter has that maybe calibrated models are, there's more scope to kind of flex these assumptions in a calibrated model, whereas for an econometric model, you're more constrained, but we'll get more into that. Similarly, the consultancy dummy is largely negative and significant, but not huge. It's in the range of 2 to 3%. Similarly, the model seems to be working quite well. The combined share coefficient is positive and significant and large, which you would expect. More concentrated markets should lead to larger changes in price predicted by a merger simulation. And then similarly, wherever the rest of your controls are significant, they do go in the direction you would expect. Phase 2 mergers are more likely to be complicated, more likely to have higher price rises potentially. If it's blocked again, that might be because the price rises were very high. And then similarly, in the models where we include estimates for competitors and the market as a whole, you would expect that the coefficient should be negative, because when 2 firms merge, the largest incentive to raise price would be between the merging firms, and then any feedback effects would, competitors would also have an incentive to raise price, but by much less. So there's some evidence to support the hypothesis. And for the last slide, we then calculate marginal effects for this full model where we control for everything. And just to explain the table a little bit, so what we did is we then tested directly whether there's a difference in the predicted price rise between telecoms versus non-telecoms, econometric demand versus non-econometric demand, consultancy versus the commission, by taking the difference in the marginal effects of these two values of each variable. And then we see does that vary depending on the values of the other 2 things. So there's a lot to see here. We generally see that there's a lot of green in the top, a bit of green and red in the middle, and a lot of red at the bottom. So you know, at a high level, you might interpret that to mean that price rises are indeed higher in telecoms, but with a few exceptions. And there are a few cuts of the data where the difference is not significant. So where there's a blank, it means that the difference in the margin is not significant, 5%. So this would mean that there's no difference between telecoms and non-telecoms cases in terms of the predicted price rises for models performed by consultants. So, you know, it's not, you know, there's a bit of variance as well. Then moving on to the middle one, here for the model type, econometric, it's a mixed picture. However, price rises are, so if you look at this row here, the telecoms non-consultancy, because if you recall the complaint about econometric models being lower than non-econometric was specifically put forward by, in a telecoms case, 302, which was blocked, and there was a complaint that the commission, so non-consultancies, were getting very different predictions between econometric and non-econometric, but actually you see this row blank means that the difference there between the two model types is not significant, so maybe, you know, maybe contradicts that hypothesis a little bit. And then the last one, the consultancy versus non-consultancy, say well red, so on average, price rises are higher for the commission versus consultancies. So yeah, so we see it's very dark red here. So for non-econometric models, this is definitely true. So like I said before, maybe there's more of a, you know, you can flex your assumptions more to perhaps a calibrated model, and therefore you get these bigger differences between consultancy and the commission. So yeah, so it's a bit of a, I would say there's support for these hypotheses, but I think there are kind of caveats that I try to tease out. So we kind of finished because I had with 8 questions. So I thought of 8, you know, based on my experience of what I've seen in these cases over the years, I've come up with 8 reasons why simulations have not been used recently. So the first 2 are the 2 things we've talked through today. So not been successful in the past. So not really. The literature review was positive, and the review of the modelling issues and decisions was, you know, I think that was fairly positive. And also the important thing is that precedent does matter in these cases. So, you know, the more that you follow the modelling in a previous case, the less likely you are to get criticised by the commission, the more likely that your model will be accepted as evidence. Question 2 was the thing we just gone through, the more regressions. So, like I say, perhaps they have not been used consistently. Perhaps being used consistency is an impossible thing to achieve, given how different these models can be. And small sample sizes, perhaps, you know, there's only been 17 cases out of thousands that have used these. They're not as popular. In the US, for example, from experience from speaking with my US colleagues, the merger simulations get used a lot more regularly, it's a lot more accepted. So there'll be a larger sample size there than here in Europe. So some other questions just to finish. Is it because data is not readily available? I would say no. So to estimate these demand models, you often need rich scanner data that covers both emerging parties and also other competitors in the market. That is widely available across many industries, particularly in kind of retail sector, so supermarket data, etc. Data science techniques, the web scraping, there's, you know, people are very good at that as well. And similarly, the European Commission in these merger reviews has a strong ability to request data. So, you know, I don't think data is an explanation. Number 4, are they not worth it from a cost-benefit standpoint? Possibly clear-cut cases. So if you know that your merger is going to be very anti-competitive, you know, as to Sainsbury's was blocked, perhaps, you know, was always going to be a hard case to get cleared because, you know, number 4 merging with number 2 to create number 1 was always going to be a tough sell. And similarly, if you know that the merger is not very likely to cause issues, maybe because we don't overlap in many products, they're not backwards competitors, then investing the time and the resources in creating one of these models might not be worth it. However, it's worth reminding though that these models are can be a lot more precise than simple measures such as GUPPy or UPP, which are a lot more popular. And then one thing that's also important to not forget about is divestment modeling. So as a bit of context, the kind of divestment discussions happen at the end of these merger reviews. It's a very frantic period, and it's when the clients get most, understandably, the most nervous because, you know, giving up their assets at a fire sale price, because obviously when you have to sell these assets, the other competitors know you have to sell these assets to get the merger through, and the price of the assets goes, you know, can go down a lot. So instead of making decisions about which divestments to offer based on, you know, less sophisticated evidence, such as just like market shares in different products and different brands, you know, the merger simulation model would be able to tell the commission far more precisely that, okay, if we sell this brand, then, you know, we can see that across the board price rises now are on average less than 2%. So I think it's important. Number 5, not enough time in the merger review process. So for those that don't know, merger reviews are done under a very intense time review. It's you know, for phase 1, I think it's about 25 working days. That doesn't sound like a lot, but actually the amount of lead up to that point is huge. So on huge big mergers, the merging parties will be working with the economists and the lawyers for, you know, up to a year before the deal is even announced to get everything together, the data, the strategy for the case. But when the clock starts on day 1, things get very intense very quickly. The commission will send you lots of requests for information, usually on a Friday evening at 5 p.m. And then ask you to have answers by Monday morning. You know, so things get very, very intense very quickly. But then this is to say that a merger simulation model takes time to put together because it's based on a lot of data, a lot of modeling. You have to, you know, a lot of coding, a lot of back and forth. So either for us, the consultants, or the commission, it is a, you know, it is a big undertaking, and also for the clients. You know, we consultants charge by the hour, and so these things can become very expensive for the clients as well. So we want to make sure that they're getting, you know, they're doing it for a good reason. So my comment would be maybe we need to advise clients that it would be worthwhile and get it implemented earlier on in the process. And then there's one interesting case as well, which I've mentioned here, which is the Unilever case, where the nested logic econometric demand model that they estimated, they also use that model not just for the merger simulation, but also for the market definition stage. So before you do the simulation, you first have to define the market, and in the deodorants market, the question is the market all deodorant, or is it male deodorant versus female deodorant? And they answered that question empirically using the estimated demand model, which then fed into the merger simulation model. So that was that seemed like a good thing to do. So there's lots of other benefits to do. Number 6 is it maybe have our techniques and has the academic literature not kind of brought us up to speed with the real world? And I would say no. Big thing, of course, recently is tech. A lot of these tech firms are platforms, two-sided markets, etc. Therefore, would a traditional merger simulation for, I don't know, groceries, would it not be applicable in a say, I don't know, Google buying Bing or whatever to happen? The answer is no. There have been academic papers that have done merger simulations in two-sided markets. For example, they looked at a newspaper merger in, I think it was the Netherlands. That's the same as the platform, right? You've got advertisers on one side, readers on the other, whereas in platforms you've got, again, those people who are searching Google and then advertisers paying for advertising space on Google. So I would say that, there's lots of support for what we could do in the academic literature. I just think that in practice, that hasn't been used yet. A good example of this is the famous ELP demand model. The first paper was written in 1995, so it's pretty old by now. Yeah, there's only been one case of these mergers that we've looked at where they actually use BLP, and that's considered to be a far better demand model than, say, a single nested merger model. Question 7 is where I lack of economic expertise. I would say no. The Commission has done a lot of these merger simulations. Presumably they've retained that knowledge. Lexecon has a lot of experience in doing these. Similarly, there's a question that's often raised is that is it an issue more in the US is that you have these judges deciding on these mergers, but these judges do not have specific economic training. But like I say, it's not really a thing in Europe. Judges and courts would only get involved if the European Commission blocks a merger and the merging parties appeal. But that doesn't happen very often at all because mergers create so much uncertainty for businesses. The amount of time it would take to appeal to the General Court or even the European Court of Justice is just too long, and there's so few of these cases that actually do get appealed. So I don't think that's a reason either. Which leads us to our last one, which is there a wider general trend away from the use of economic evidence in the merger review? I would say I think that is possible. And I say that because even though there's also been, obviously merger simulations have not been used since 2018, but we have also seen a general decline in the use of economic modelling generally in these cases over time. And there is an argument out there that the competition authorities are moving away from looking at economic evidence to instead looking at stuff such as requesting internal documents from the merging parties and trying to find that document that says that we're going to buy this company because we want to raise prices by 30%. And of course, that is good evidence. I just think that the weight, the evidentiary weight that's put on economic evidence versus internal documents versus responses from competitors has maybe shifted a bit since I started work. So yeah, that's it really. Any questions?
So Tanya Selim online, her microphone is not working, so I'll just read her comment. What I wanted to add is that there are many factors that determine which models are ultimately adopted in their final decision by authority, and they depend on factors including what data and information is available, the legal process, etc. For example, in VF3 in the UK, I think the Compass Lexecon model included quality investment effects, but that was rejected by the CMA, who ultimately did their own analysis, but excluding quality and investment effects and analysing the latter outside the model. Would it be interesting to add that case into your analysis, even though not the EC case, not an EC case, sorry?
The answer is basically yes. Thank you for raising that. I wanted to discuss that as well, because basically you're completely right. The CMA, as far as I'm aware, and before the CMA was formed a decade ago, it was the Competition Commission and the OFT, two different authorities that merged. They've never done a merger simulation until Vodafone 3. So we all know about Vodafone 3 because it was a 4-3 merger in the UK telecoms industry. Like I said, the background was not positive because the previous merger between 3 and O2, which was attempted in 2016, was blocked. It was blocked by the European Commission because Brexit hadn't happened yet. So the European Commission had jurisdiction. But now since Brexit, the CMA has jurisdiction and they cleared the case. I would say yes. I would say that the models, so the model, what was interesting about that case was that was like the first case where actually 3 models were put forward. There was one put forward by CMA, one put forward by Vodafone, who were being represented by a different consultancy, Frontier Economics, and then there was a model put forward by 3, which was a model put forward by Compass Lexecon. So that's never happened before, having three models that we have to decide on. I would also say that the CMA, I haven't had a chance to read the decision in detail, and I know that the CMA did officially reject both of the models put forward by Vodafone 3 and only put weight on its own model. I would say that that's a slightly simplistic view of looking at it. They definitely would have taken into account the 3 different models and how they all, which the similarities and differences, and just officially they would say that they only put weight on their own model. I would certainly think about adding it to the data set, maybe controlling the fact that it's being done by a different authority to the commission. But yeah, maybe that means that there's hope for the technique yet. So we had 6 years of nothing, and then suddenly a big UK case came out, and maybe that shows that the CMA wants to do things a bit differently.
I have one question. It's really interesting. In all the throughout the entire talk, and the left-hand side variable is always the price rise, or the expected price rise. Is there any discussion among people doing this professionally kind of about alternative left side variables? For instance, the impact on innovation activities, or I don't know. I mean, we know that the companies can cartelize, can collude in different ways, not only on prices. So, right. So, is there anything kind of trying to predict? Okay, if these 2 companies merge, then the likelihood that this and this positive and negative thing is increasing.
It's interesting. As far as I'm aware, these models have always typically focused on prices or quality adjusted prices. In principle, you can also look at volumes. The models will also spit out predicted changes in volumes. That's what we care more about in the industry is, output versus prices, whereas, whether output will go down a lot. In terms of innovation, it's not my area of expertise. I know there's a lot of thinking about the impact of mergers on innovation. I would say that any modelling that's done there is probably being done outside of a merger simulation, official merger simulation context. But in principle, yeah, I agree that I can't see any reason why that kind of might not work.
Or maybe, if I understood correctly, kind of Peter introduced you as saying you had worked on the Asda Sainsbury mergers of supermarkets.
Yes.
I mean, here, one aspect of supermarkets, which is very important for social policy, is do you have supermarkets in small villages, or do you not have them, and people have to drive for 15 miles, right?
Yeah.
So are these considerations that were weighed?
Certainly. In fact, that was the main consideration. So from what I mean, I for disclosure, because I worked on this case at previously consultancy, and I actually moved jobs kind of during that case. So I worked on the case at the start, but not through on the kind of pre-notification stage. And then obviously I wasn't working on it when the CMA was discussing the case, but from what I understand, the main focus of the analysis was, if you're in a town, do you only have choices between Sainsbury's and Asda? And if so, post-merger, are you effectively facing a monopoly? But that's a separate that's a whole separate analysis, I would say. And we do that a lot in cases, particularly retail cases and groceries cases. I think in that case, they did calculate some GUPPs for CMA, so gross upward pricing pressure indices, which showed that price rises would be, I can't remember whether they were high or whether they were modest, but what they did was that, okay, price rises are modest, but families spend such a large share of their income on groceries that we're really concerned about this. And I think that was one of the main concerns that for why they all spent the rate.
I mean, here you could jump the argument even around, right? Saying maybe there is a village or a town which has 2 supermarkets not fit, and the 2 maybe the market is not big enough to really sustain both, so they're both doing badly. Now, if they merge and the surviving ones, so to speak, can increase their prices to some extent, then at least it's more beneficial for the supermarket to stay there and to provide the service in the first place. And so elderly people also who cannot travel so easily, they have access.
I mean, we do typically try to put forward a positive. We always try to put forward a positive case in these merger control reviews and that kind of thing. Sometimes it's like a failing firm defense. This firm will exit the market unless it is acquired. again, like with our arguments about whether the merger will lead to efficiencies, the competition authorities are generally quite skeptical about this kind of thing. You know, we try to put forward good economic evidence to support that argument. Sorry. Yeah.
Just on this,
Sorry.
so I do have I mean, when doing something like this, we kind of, you know, we are bound by the data available and dominantly data is available on the price impact of a merger, therefore we're focused on price impact. And it's sort of misleading because that is not necessarily the only story with a merger. And that reminds me that in the old UK Competition Commission, they used to do this exercise that, after 2-3 years after a merger, a list of mergers, and not just the big ones, they looked at certain things. Did entry happen as predicted? Was there innovation as predicted? Did this happen as predicted? So lots of more qualitative things rather than just a quantitative price change. And that was immensely useful, and they did for years, but I'm not aware of that actually happening anymore, at least not publicly in any other competition authority.
I think the European Commission is doing it. I think they launched a review recently where they were going to collect some post-merger data. I don't think we're finished right yet. But you wrote a paper precisely on this.
I mean, yeah, we've written several papers on this, and in one of them, actually, the work we've done for the European Commission, we reviewed all of these UK Competition Commission ex post evaluations, which again, very qualitative. These are not econometric estimates, are really informative. So it's some of them actually went out and did surveys to market participants. Do you feel that, you know, there is now less competition in the market, or various questions? And I thought it was a really useful exercise, and I hadn't been aware of it beforehand, but we reviewed it, gave it to the European Commission. Well, you know, maybe something will happen.
Yeah, you mentioned the efficiencies and them being incorporated into these merger simulations. So I was wondering, have there been cases where the efficiencies had such an impact on the predicted prices that they could have influenced how the Commission ruled about the decision in the end? Because from what I thought, the EU Commission has so far only accepted efficiencies in cases where there was no significant threat to competition anyway, and when there was, they usually reject them on the legal grounds of the three steps test, such as that they are not merger specific, or that they are unlikely to be passed on the final consumer.
Yes, certainly. So in our cases, the synergies they weren't put forward. I don't know if we have the slide, but basically there were very few predicted price rises where synergies had been incorporated, and when they were incorporated, I think they were understood that they were quite modest, so they were bringing down the price rise by a little bit. And then in a lot of the cases where the merging parties have proposed big synergies, they were often rejected, to be honest. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much. I hope that was somewhat interesting. If you have any comments, please feel free to drop me or Peter an email. And thank you for